I am back. I'm continuing the career of, I guess, reversing my career and going to DevRel or something here. But I thought it would be fun. I want to do a little bit of a series here of going through how we built the MCP server, specifically because I want to point out like how production systems work. Kind of help you figure out how this works, how ours works. Maybe ours is good, bad in some places. But the tie-in is also generally we've spent a bunch of time trying to figure out how to make this kind of pattern work well with Sentry. Had a bunch of problems, still have some problems that we're working through, but consider this part one. I'm going to write up some written content and probably do a few more videos over the next week. My wife is out of town, so I've got a lot of flexibility in the evenings where I have nothing better to do. So um, I figured today it would be maybe interesting just to talk about how we approach building the server, maybe rough overall architecture, maybe how you can think about it. And I guess in an ideal state, this would be like, here's the skeleton or the create MCP app that is very much a work in progress, but like some things to think about. And this is how I thought about it. And it's far from fleshed out because the spec is constantly changing. But yeah, I guess take that for what it is. So I've got our local package here. This is the Sentry MCP server. This is the thing you see in production here. It's this service, which is it's I guess first generation server sent events SSE, like slash SSE, this one. It's that level of transport, plus we have a standard IO transport, which is distributed through an NPM package. And so this repo is the mono repo that contains all that. It comes with all the complexity that is associated with any version of a mono repo, but particularly a JavaScript mono repo. And so bear with me. This is going to be like a live demo-ish kind of thing. So this may be awful, maybe good. Hopefully it's educational or at least entertaining. All right. So when I set out to build this thing, I had one goal. I saw the streaming spec coming about. I saw the OAuth spec coming about. I'm like, okay, like this kind of signal that this could go in a direction that actually makes it usable to businesses like Sentry, where we can sort of provide data. That data, is useful in a lot of contexts, but it's also useful in the context of something like Cursor, which is the editor that I generally use daily for things. And OAuth was the sort of missing link at the end of that. You need a way to actually authenticate to the service, and binding an access token that you manually generate, store in the system somewhere. That's not just not how the world works, right? And so we built this as soon as OAuth had any glimmer of hope. And I will caveat that I know they are changing the spec around OAuth, but I want to start with sort of how this works. And so, what is the easiest way to do this? What would be really interesting is an architectural diagram, but I would need a whiteboard for that because I'm incompetent when it comes from a machine. But there are a few things to understand about this service. And so there are a lot of complex diagrams for how these flows work. But what you should know is Sentry itself, like Sentry.io, we have an OAuth provider. We had already built this. I built it like 10 years ago. Works okay. Doesn't actually support the latest spec, the 2.1 iteration, but it supports 2.0, which has been out a long time, right? And what is particularly good about the way we built this, and we built it in partnership with Cloudflare, is Cloudflare built very quickly a OAuth 2.1 compatible intermediary. What I mean by that is the MCP server using their packaging, their libraries, provides both a client and a provider. That is, it's a client of Sentry's upstream OAuth provider, and it is a provider to the downstream client. So it's a downstream provider to Cursor. So when let's do this actually from this point of view. So here is sorry, I usually use Windows. Bear with me. I do not have a webcam on my desktop here, unfortunately. So we've got the server here. I'm going to boot up the development server, which is actually booting up a bunch of things, but don't worry too much about that. And I'm going to boot up the MCP inspector, which comes from the official MCP bindings. This is the JavaScript bindings, but it's a local web server that allows you to kind of test your MCP server. And hang on, we might be missing something for some reason. Let's just make sure. Okay, we'll get that up and running. First things first, I have this habit of just like use localhost, don't use 127. For the most part, one works better than the other depending on the situation, but I've had a lot of problems, particularly with the flows on this when you work on Windows because you're using WSL. and the networking doesn't work quite transparently. So anyways, we've got this in SSE server. We need to grab this URL. You always do this. And this is what this provides, which is I guess this is like the beauty of the simplicity. So I've got an OAuth prompt here, right? This is just like authorize the service. This is kind of new. There was a security vulnerability that existed where you could kind of bypass the auth flow, because what happens here is it's many to one. So there are many clients, Cursor, Windsurf, Claude, etc. For me, just me. And they all need to share one upstream access token. That is, when I click approve, well, it's going to error. It's, I guess, live demo world. Cookie secret is not defined. Okay, we got to go define that thing. Ooh, how do I hide? I don't know how to stream. Let's see. We've got a, what do I need? I need cookie secret. We're going to attempt to not expose a client ID or anything else that might exist in a file here. So I need to define this cookie secret, and it's like, I don't think this has to be very long, but I don't actually know. And we probably want, I don't know if there's a new line. We're probably going to need a new line. And this is going to go, so this is the Cloudflare service. This is honestly, this environment variable thing for Cloudflare is absolutely horrendous. This is like one of the biggest issues they need to fix right now from a DevX. There's a lot of versions of this. I'll talk about a few, but so I need to put this in the Cloudflare service, which is our MCP Cloudflare package.dev.vers. Okay, it may or may not work now. We'll see. Hopefully that's correct, to where I don't have to open a file and expose a potentially sensitive thing, which then I have to revoke after I record this video because I have no idea how to scrub things. So let's see, back on this flow. This is probably all the same. We're probably okay. We click approve. It's going to Sentry. This is our OF provider. Pardon the awful typeface and sizing and stuff. We need it. We're working on rebuilding these pages and whatnot in general. They're like, this is like the old school 10-year-old server rendered technology of Sentry, whereas everything else has been React for a long time. Anyways, so upstream provider, there's one Sentry. This right now is going to give me an access token when I click approve. This access token goes back to the MCP server. That MCP server then stores it secretly and gives a new access token to the MCP inspector in this case, that kind of is a pass-through, is effectively a proxy, but it's a different access token, and it's a different client ID and all these things, right? Now, when I go through the same flow with Cursor, which I actually can show you, it should work. Let's just change this to be our local server. So if I go through this with Cursor, back to this flow, MCP, CLI, proxy, blah, 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 I'm approving again. Behind the scenes, first off, you'll notice it's not going to show Sentry. There was no prompt on Sentry again because it's already been approved on Sentry's end to grant access to the MCP server. So it's a little bit confusing, frankly, for a user experience. But what happened is both the MCP inspector and Cursor behind the scenes are sharing one access token upstream with Sentry itself. In the MCP server, those are two separate access tokens. So the inspector's token is unique, Cursor's token is unique. They don't share anything. Technically, you can restrict permissions in different ways. But anyways, this is what I mean by intermediary. We're proxying the whole thing. Cloudflare and this proxy are enabling us to support OAuth 2.1, which the particular feature that is needed there, and if you don't understand this, that's fine, is client registration. What that means is I have a client ID. So you often see like OAuth client ID, something like this, right? I have that. It's dynamically generated. It's sent to a registration endpoint. That gives me the new secret. Cool, I can create new access. So anyways, so intermediary, this is a really big deal. Makes this really easy to work with, makes it really importantly easy to adopt for any traditional, company that exists in the world. A lot of us are not building things from scratch. We're not going to build an entirely new business on top of this. We wanted to just drop in, augment the existing services, augment existing APIs. So that's where we start. You need authentication. OAuth is the right way to solve that problem. So we go back to the service. The core of, and this repo is, it's technically not open source. It's what we call fair source, which just means if you're a venture-backed startup, you cannot use our code or we will sue the fuck out of you. In all honesty, that's how it works. And what I mean by that is just generally like we have this like code of ethics and use our code, learn from it. We don't actually care, but you cannot take our code, build a competing service, and commercialize it. And it's like sort of the fairness clause. But generally speaking, you can take it, you can fork it, whatever. Honestly, most of this is like pretty reproducible, so it's not a big deal. Like use it to learn, use it to whatever. But just caveat, it's technically not open source. It's fair source. Um, okay, so we've got a bunch of packages in here. It's on GitHub. Sentry MCP on GitHub. You can find the link if you just go to the MCP site, click GitHub or whatever. You understand how it works. There's a handful of packages in here. I do not claim to be the best at TypeScript. I do whatever works. I don't really care that much about semantics of the whole thing. But I've got a few things in here that matter. So if you're looking at this and you're trying to figure out how to set it up and maybe how somebody who's halfway competent would set up, this is for you. I've got the server. This is the majority of the code. TypeScript config, literally just TypeScript config. This is a mock server, but it specifically mocks for Sentry's API. So what I mean by that is if you go in here, sorry, it's not really well designed. I was going to break these up, but it's just a ton of JSON payloads, and it's using mock service workers to bind this. And this just makes it a little bit easier to test because otherwise, like testing this against Sentry's production API service, you have to do so much work to set up fixtures and all these other things. So this just makes it easy. So that's our mocks package. Evals are what they sound like. I'll talk about these, but generally speaking, evals are tests. And so we've got a bunch of these evals in here. And what they do is they let us test, like, if I had a query that was, what organizations do I have access to in Sentry? It should return roughly this organization slug that I've defined in the mocks, right? This is kind of just like a loose way to test, like, do your tool definitions roughly do what you would want them to do under a set of situations? What I mean by that is in an MCP, you are not using, in our context at the very least, you're not using an LLM. You don't control the system prompts. You don't control any of these things. You're returning information that can then be used by those prompts, which Cursor is designed or Claude is designed, or Anthropic's designed rather for Claude. And so in this case, we're like, well, given, in my case, it's GPT-4o. When I call GPT-4o, which I've defined over here in the utils file, I'm just doing this thing. It's telling it, hey, you're an assistant, figure this stuff out. Tell me if the answer's right, basically. And so I'm trying to emulate an agent environment that would use our tool and roughly verify that it kind of does what we want. And you could optimize these prompts a little bit like traditional evals, but again, you don't control the upstream prompts. So you're just going for like rough accuracy, approximation here. So I've got a bunch of these prompts, these evals defined. Some are a little bit more complex than others. Like you'll see list issues. It's like, well, I'm actually verifying like, yeah, you should actually have the stack trace and things like that in here. But again, approximations. These are not quite the same way you would approach evals if you were building like an actual agent where they might be much more exhaustive and they're much more plentiful. I'm just litmus testing, like, does this work? But in a way that's like an integration test. So we have the evals, right? Makes sense. And then we have the Cloudflare service. And like, well, what's the difference between the Cloudflare service and the core MCP server? Fundamentally, there is an MCP server, and that uses the model context protocol TypeScript SDK, which is this repo here. I guess that's not like an actual URL I can type. It uses this core repository, which includes the MCP server, right? Makes sense. Cloudflare has an additional set of bindings on top of it that works with their durable objects, their agents SDK, things like that. And so this abstraction exists because we also release a version, like I mentioned, for standard IO, which is distributed on NPM. NPM.js, what do we call it? Sentry MCP server. So this package is the MCP server package. This is the MCP Cloudflare package. That's how you should understand it. So hypothetically speaking, this MCP server is completely compatible with any interface. This implementation is not. And what we do in this implementation is we have two things. We have the website you saw, so the client, which is this, right? This is just a React app. It doesn't need to be React in all honesty. It's just like easier. Frankly, this is the problem with the internet these days. I needed Tailwind to write basic CSS for no good reason, because everything uses Tailwind now. And to write Tailwind, good luck. The easiest way to do it is with something like Vite. And so thus I adopted Vite, and all of a sudden I'm in React land or whatever. And anyways, you can take advantage, I guess, of rich JavaScript. That's really easy, but it's a single page. And you'll quickly find when I jump into the repository that creates a lot of problems. Like I have this client app right here, and let's actually just go into here. So I have like this, right? Like in the client, we've got all of the code for that single page. Makes sense. You saw the OAuth screen, the authorization screen, that actually exists in a completely different thing. It exists over here. It's server render. Sure, you could use a Next.js or something else, but that's more complexity. And the goal is not complexity in this shit. The app is not complicated. But we have the server render thing, which is literally just hard coded HTML and me copy pasting variables in here because I cannot be asked to spend a day just to figure out how to share the Tailwind compilation steps between these two things, let alone the Vite steps. This is the problem with the JavaScript ecosystem. So this is not going to be a rant around that. It's just frustrating because this is useless work. And frankly, there are no frameworks that honestly avoid the useless work. They just add more complexity. I don't know why it is. I'm not here to shit talk all that, but that's what it is, right? So Cloudflare is just that. Server and client. Client is literally just that page. It's integrated in this repo because what I do in here is I'm actually importing the tool definitions and all these other things. And this is just so I can self-document it, right? You don't have to do this. You could also, if you were a little bit more clever or try hard, I guess, if you will, you could have it actually connect to the MCP service on the web page and then just query in real time, which I think would be kind of fun and a little bit more portable. So, maybe at some point I'll try to convert the repo to do that. But generally speaking, you can ignore client. Doesn't really matter. It's just a web page. So server is what you want. What's cool about this is that it's actually pretty easy. So I mentioned the OAuth provider. This is Cloudflare's OAuth provider abstraction for workers. I don't know if it was just built for their agents MCP case, but it works beautifully as an intermediary here, right? Still pretty new. It's had some issues, but generally speaking, you're defining these OAuth endpoints, which actually come from this default handler. I'll talk about that in a second. And then once you're authenticated, they forward to this API handler. I'm not going to jump into like every little nuance of this thing, but it's super easy to implement. You implement, we've got the OAuth stuff in here. It's mostly straightforward. It's much more complicated right now because this approval dialog abstraction, which is like a security concern, probably does not all have to live as boilerplate in everybody's repository, but it was a brand new thing as of like a week ago that had to be resolved. And so Cloudflare implemented it. We base our implementation on top of theirs. It's not abstracted in the library or anything. So just understand, like 2 days ago, this file, sorry, this file is actually still small, but this file used to just be 2 functions, and now it's okay. I forgot I refactored this earlier. It's still 2 functions. We just put all the other code here. So none of this code needed to exist. Generally speaking, it is quite a lot of code. And all of a sudden there's like cookies going on. There's the cookie secret value that you saw. Just know that this should be able to like go away. It doesn't need to be implemented by every single person. I'm pretty confident Cloudflare can find a way to bundle a lot of this code into their core abstractions. So anyways, back to the thing. Pretty simple. App is here. This defines our endpoints. I've defined a robot's text, even though nothing follows these things. Like literally everything scrapes everything all the time. OLMs.text doesn't really matter. Nothing really follows these things. It's just a fun gimmick going on. And then most importantly, our OAuth endpoints. This is straightforward. There is a repository by Cloudflare that I think they use GitHub, and there's an authentication flow. It's a good demo app that does this. It's differently complicated than ours, I would say. But the thing I'm trying to show you is a production MCP application, not just a demo app. This is like what we're running live right now. It's what we've been iterating on, what we try to make actually production ready in the sense of like it needs monitoring. It needs to be like good DX in the sense of it needs to be easy to maintain. Testing has to exist, all these little things, right? Okay, so straightforward. Bulk of the work is here. We've got a little bit complicated an abstraction here for 2 reasons. 1, because we need Sentry to exist, because we need telemetry. And 2, there's some challenges making Sentry exist. And I guess there's technically a 3rd reason that we need to make it work with durable objects in this little bit of a complicated API. And so what you should know here is this is kind of how you would see upstream in Cloudflare. We're just extending this MCP agent to create ours. We define the server on here. And then within initialization, which is like the sort of agents worker spec, we're binding tools. We've abstracted the tools. And actually, let me just show you. Cloudflare, GitHub, what is that repo? GitHub MCP. Okay. It might be this one. Hopefully they have not. No, this is their complicated example. I'm not going to look it up right now. There's a GitHub example that is a little bit simpler, but what you need to know is right here, what I can generally do is I can do this server.tool. It's here. Thank you, cursor. This is how you define tools. We don't do that because you see this dot props thing. This is a problem. I have a generic server. It doesn't have access to this dot props because this dot props is Cloudflare's implementation. So what we do, we get rid of all that. We use scoped bindings. We pass in context to the server function, which then actually this is no longer Cloudflare specific. This is our generalized server code. This is not what we want. Should be this, I think. Is it here? Yeah. So this is our generalized code. Passes in this context again, not Cloudflare related, but gives us an access token. Gives us some other Sentry specific stuff like the host, which is like Sentry.io, the organization slug, which we kind of try to bind to default. User ID. User ID is literally just so we can track and debug problems when they happen. And then client ID is similar, so we can track and debug what's going on. I'll talk a little bit about that because that's like the production level telemetry. So we've got this abstraction that we built. And honestly, this was like the most annoying thing. And I did this again because I just wanted to share standard IO and production remote. Do you need to do that? No, it's kind of unreasonable. But maybe there's a real world use case where standard IO matters. So in our case, why it might matter is because you can self-host Sentry. And hypothetically, you can run the MCP against Sentry. Could you run our cloud service against it? Well, maybe we could have you pass the host name into every tool call. And if you're not familiar with the tool call, this is what they look like. Let's just go to the definitions. It's like list teams. So it's got a function name, it's got a description, it's got parameters. So we could be like, oh yeah, Sentry host. We could add this to every tool call, but then the LLM's got to know what to do with that. It's always got to like think about it, if you will. It's always got to put it in there. It's just more room for error. So if you self-hosted Sentry, our thought process was, okay, standard IO transport, cool, bind the host, you're fine. And what I mean by that is you can actually run that transport with Sentry MCP, actually, sorry, it's PMPMX, Sentry MCP server at latest, host equal mysentry.example.com, and then you would also pass in your access token XYZ. And this actually works. Like this is a standard IO transport. This is what's built in our package to distribute. So that's the thing. That's why it exists. It's actually live right now. You just don't know because it's standard IO, so it's just accepting inputs. Okay. Anyways, that's why it's abstracted like this. What this does is it lets us bind all of the calls with context. And so you'll see in here, we're binding all these. We've kept the context scope just like we would have in Cloudflare, but our own implementation. We're doing this for resources, tools, and prompts. Really, all you got to worry about is tools. Nothing uses any of this yet. And so tools are like the main thing that's going to be a concern. There's a bunch of abstraction in here. I'll go through this in a bit, but just know you can look at this, probably reason about it. You know, there are a bunch of areas where I'm like, I give up. TypeScript, you're going to do what you're going to do. Whatever. You're probably smarter than me. You can figure it out. Anyways, tool definitions, MCP server, standard IO, and Cloudflare. But the bulk of this is in the MCP server codebase itself. And so let's get rid of that. There's a lot going on in here. I'm not going to try to cover it all, but just know the bulk of the code is in the server. The second thing that matters, we'll actually walk through standard IO. So standard IO, this is our distribution. We package this up on NPM. It gets versioned, pushed out, supports Sentry hosts, access tokens. We also let you override the Sentry DSN, so you can either disable Sentry's reporting because it reports to our cloud service, so we can debug it, or report to your own cloud service, like your own Sentry install. Initializes Sentry, so this actually works fully. It's just a node process. I'll talk about that in a minute separately. And then starts the standard IO transport, and this is just a helper function we have defined somewhere. It's pretty straightforward. Again, it uses the server right here. This is not, sorry, I'm not even using the latest code, am I? We have some issues with Sentry's MCP helper. Oh, right. We have this helper that we built to do better instrumentation with MCP, but it's broken on Cloudflare, unfortunately, right now. We're working on fixing that, and there's just some complexity going on. So it looks a little bit different how we instrument the server here than it does in the Cloudflare service. And so what I mean by that is, I guess what I mean by that is we're not actually really instrumenting the MCP server here. We're just mounting it. Okay. I think the most useful thing to walk through here is like the general flow. So when you connect to MCP, there's some authorization thing, which is just pass the access token, verify it. That on the Cloudflare instance completely abstracted. On the standard IO instance, it's just bound in context because all we're doing is passing it on. So there's nothing to learn about that. We just deal with all that with OAuth. Second thing, you're defining a bunch of tools. And if you're not familiar with the spec, I've got these split into definitions and tools. And I only have this split specifically, and it's mentioned up here, because I import this elsewhere. And so it's just a set of constants that are not going to be complicated, that are not going to have, say, node functionality or node imports that I can import in that Vite JavaScript client-side app. I don't love this. There's not great patterns to do this better these days. It is what it is. It kind of sucks. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. We've got a bunch of these definitions here. Again, this is not the simplest way you could do it, right? You can bind them all in tools. You can just do server.tool like I showed. Do the name, the description, everything else in line. We're trying for maintainability here. This is not the best version of maintainability because the definitions are separate from the function calls, but it is what it is. So take list teams. Like I said, it's got a function name. This is the tool name, which has to be unique amongst your tool set. It's got a description. This has to be LLM optimized. However you do that, you can decide your flavor of the week thing. I'm using XML tags, whatever you want to call these, to kind of separate things. And what I mean by that is, like, you'll see down here, I give it examples. Oh, this is how I would do this specific thing. That's the description. There are a bunch of caveats here. I'm not going to try to dive into them because they're going to change. But like certain implementations have certain restrictions. For example, when I was testing this in VS Code, it was using GPT 4.0. It truncates the description to 1024 characters. I will tell you, this description, probably double that. I don't know, but it's like 1024 is not much. That's not great because this description is your primary capability to influence the upstream agent, because this is prompt engineering, if you will. So this is where you control a lot of it, but the limitations on token counts and lengths limits what you can do here. Anyways, I'm using a couple of concepts that I was inspired by Neon, the database guys, how they did theirs, which is as examples and as hints. And what I'm generally trying to do is help it make the right call. And particularly with hints, I'm trying to help it know maybe what it should call first or what it should do. And so, a lot of these are like, if you don't know the organization, just look it up first instead of guessing, or instead of not passing it because it's optional, because we'll try to use the default, right? So it's little bits and pieces like that, right? It could be better. The one other thing I'll note is the second area where you can influence the prompt is in the parameters. So I've got parameters defined here, right? I've got the organization slug and the region URL. And this is region URL, like Sentry can be in Germany, it can be in the US. We have different tenants. I abstract those just to make them more reusable, but like this describe method, this is useful to help influence the LLM upstream so it knows what those parameters are for. So absolutely define these things on your parameters. Spend some time experimenting with the description. You're going to find you don't control everything. You can't just write, 3 words and have it call the right prompt. That's just not how it is. So that is what it is, but pretty straightforward, right? Let's go to the tools. Let's go to, oops. I don't know how I pop that open. It's right here anyways. So list teams, we're passing in the context. Again, this is our implementation. We bound context to pass it first. Otherwise, normally this just passes params. Context, again, gives us the host, the organization slug. It gives us the access token. All of that is going into this API service from context, which all that's doing is passing in the region URL as the host if it needs to, and it's passing in the access token. Pretty straightforward abstraction. Goal is easy to read them out. This does a few other things. So first off, we got some complexity here. We're just trying to infer the default organization slug, whatever, boilerplate. Instrumentation, ignore this for now. I'll come back to it. And then we're just making an upstream call. We're making the list teams call to Sentry's API. And then most importantly, everything is output as Markdown. It's formatted. It's trying to use semantics and signal that are very well understood across the internet because of how models are trained, that the LLM in the most average of scenarios should understand what it means and how it's used. It's still not going to be perfect, but generally speaking, this works pretty well in my experience. I've not tested JSON schema in this particular instance, but what I've found, generally speaking, is Markdown is the least common denominator in the uses I've tried. So your mileage may vary, but like, who cares? Just use Markdown. Just move on. We're optimizing for this situation, right? And that's it. It just returns this as text. I'm going to make one more note. Again, it returns as text because of our abstraction. This might change when the MCP spec evolves and you can do more, but generally speaking, right now, all we can do that's really useful for cases like ours is return text. What that's actually doing under the hood is it's returning this JSON payload right here with the content, the type, and then the text in the output. Because you can also return errors. Which I think, is this supposed to be text? I don't even remember. Doesn't matter. But it can return a number of things, right? It can't do a lot yet. Like maybe you have attachments depending on your use case, but the common case is you're going to be having text. My hope is that you can do streaming responses later because we have some problems right now that you can't solve without streaming. But generally speaking, returning text, it's pretty straightforward. Look at the examples of the MCP client. It's like the full-on thing, but our abstraction tries to simplify it, less boilerplate. Okay, and that's it. That is roughly the MCP server. And so I want to take that and I want to talk about like really what it takes to get this into production. So there's a few things that happen. Cloudflare, straightforward. You've got the abstraction in here. We also have, the standard IO thing, the transport. All we've done is basically set up this core MCP server package to go to NPM, just as normal. We're using TS down, which is the same as TS up. I'm in the wrong package. I'm like, this looks a little unfamiliar. But we're just using TS down. We're packaging it up. We're binding a DSN. No, this is not sensitive data. Please don't use it. Otherwise, I got to rotate it. I don't want your junk data in here. I want Sentry's data in here. We're setting an environment so we know it's standard IO, the version, etc. Doesn't matter. Standard. This is basically like a default stock template for that. Probably some things wrong in here. Don't care. And just binding the MCP, the Sentry MCP CLI, right? And this is the thing I showed you at first, where it takes a number of arguments up here, access token, version, host, Sentry DSN, and just boots up that transport, okay? So straightforward, took a little bit of fiddling to get going. It exports a bunch of stuff, and all these exports are, generally speaking, for our Cloudflare server. I'm not going to dive into every detail there, but there's two subjects I kind of want to briefly touch on. And I might go deeper in these on some video, but the first is Sentry production instrumentation, because this was a nightmare to debug and it had so many random bugs. And the second is evals and how we use them. Because I think both are, there's what I call applied engineering, and then there's people on the internet that don't build software, and I am very much just applied engineering, where I'm like, I have problems. They look the same as all the other problems I've always had. And so how do I take that application to new ideas? And so first is production monitoring. So Sentry, unfortunately, is a little bit complicated with this. And it's complicated for two reasons. And if you're not familiar with Sentry, I don't know, shame on you. You probably are, so it doesn't really matter. But what I wanted out of Sentry was at least two things. I wanted error monitoring, most importantly. It's like critical. Like you can't debug anything without Sentry these days. I've actually had to struggle through using Cloudflare's logs for the last week and 2 weeks. Not fun. Good luck finding the errors in there. Even if you do, they don't have anything useful to tell you about them. And I also wanted tracing, because half the problem of this is it can chain calls and some other things. And even though we don't quite get that with the way we trace, there's ways to sort of look at that data. And more importantly, just kind of helps you understand what's going on. And once you have tracing, you can actually make things a lot more debuggable. So I was trying to get Sentry set up, and we unfortunately had some problems where it didn't work with WebSockets, in the sense of WebSockets and server sent events, which are a pretty similar paradigm. There's not a good way for tracing to work with those. So error monitoring is fine. Error monitoring is one thing, but everything Sentry does has a trace ID these days. We pass it all over the place, and we do that. So if you send multiple data streams to Sentry, say you have errors and traces, spans, if you will, session replays or logs, which we actually have working in this. If you have a data point from that and you're using the other products, all of them are interlinked. So it's like the 1 + 1 = 3 thing. It's just more value for your money. Anyway, so we need traces. WebSockets SSE do not have a way to rationally send traces unless you control the whole spectrum. And so we still have not totally solved that, for what it's worth. We're figuring some of this out, but that was problem number one. Problem number two was Sentry did not work with durable objects at all. And it probably works now in 9.16, but there might still be outliers. We'll figure it out. Cloudflare did build something called Toucan, like the bird, the big beaked bird. That was kind of like a re-implementation of our SDK that was specific to their environment, that I think has a little bit better support, in the sense of it's more compatible with Cloudflare, but is way less featureful. And so we're going to support it, but we have worker support, and we should now have full durable object support with an asterisk. We probably have to fix some stuff, like the MCP stuff is broken right now in it. Not what we're doing, but our official wrapper is broken. Okay, so how we implement that is not the worst thing in the world, but I am missing some code, I think. Wait, am I in main? I am definitely on main. Sentry.config. Yeah, where is this? Oh, I'm just blind. Sorry. Wait, where's that? Is that in server? Okay. So there are two problems. So Sentry works everywhere. My service is a Vite client-side application, React, right? Which means I need Sentry in the browser there. Not a big deal. It's a website. It's not breaking. Who cares? We'd get some like data around tracing, but doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Which is good because it's not working at all there because there is no rational way to pass environment variables, as I can tell, to Cloudflare in the sense of like, I think this may be working or may be correct, but I'm pretty sure it's not working whatsoever in production. In the sense of, I don't think I have any actual production telemetry, even though I've defined vSentry DSN in Cloudflare. So there's some issues with their Vite integration. I'm sure they will fix it soon, but it literally is not fucking working. Even worse, I need this. So something like this, or, maybe Vite Cloudflare SHA. If it exists, it's not documented as far as I can tell. So there's some issues there. So ignore the client side because we are blind. Doesn't matter here, fortunately. Server side is what matters. Server, unfortunately, is actually a pain in the ass. What I mean by that is you go in here. We've got the Sentry with Sentry. This is, so this is our Cloudflare package. This is instrumenting a worker. So right now, this OAuth provider is a worker, not a durable object, separate things. If you're confused, don't worry. I am too, still confused. Have no idea how any of this shit works. They got weird names. Doesn't make sense, but it is what it is. We got a worker, which I think is just a function, just a web endpoint middleware proxy thingy, web server, if you will, maybe serverless web server. We wrap that with Sentry, and it will give us. I think it will give us basic web request information. Most importantly, it'll give us error handling, which is really what we need. And I have this abstraction called get Sentry config because normally what you'd have here is env, and you'd return like DSN, blah, 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 right? You'd return your Sentry config here. I have an abstraction here because I have to initialize Sentry in multiple locations because durable objects are a little bit complicated and at the very least, we have not found an obvious better way to do this. So what that looks like is I have the Sentry config thing over here. This is a little bit more complicated than it needs to be, but I promise you it makes sense. At least it makes sense to me. I'm returning my standard configuration over here. I've got the DSN, I've got tracing enabled. I'm sending basically like IP addresses so we can like trace down what's going on. The environment. I'm enabling our logging beta. I'll show you what that is in case you have no idea. This console logging thing is also logging beta. It's basically it's saying send all console logs to Sentry as logs, not as errors. This Zod errors thing that I actually don't think I've seen it work yet, so I don't know if it's good, but one of my colleagues was saying we should try this out and see how we feel about it right now. Anyways, wiring this up. I've got a second function here, a partial function. If you don't know what this is, it's like function currying. So the idea is like I can do either get Sentry config env, or I can do get Sentry config.partial my stuff and then env. And so it's basically a way for me to overload some values and persist them. It's kind of like bind. Maybe there's a better way to do this. I don't know JavaScript, so, whatever. It is what it is. Anyways, so I'm calling that here, right? I am also calling it in the MCP server. And so the MCP server, because we have a Cloudflare specific transport effectively, is calling it down here, this instrument durable object with Sentry. This is important. I swear to you, I don't know how anybody survives building a durable object without Sentry. It was the most brutal 2 weeks of my life, constantly looking at these logs and see what was broken. Anyways, you can do this. It works. Mostly straightforward. I don't know if we have docs for this yet, but you can look at this code base. This code base we're dog fooding on here. It's up to date. It should work fine. Configuring the server is normal, right? We have Sentry in here. Cool. Step one, Sentry exists, which when Sentry exists, it means two things. Usually errors will get reported upstream. Just depends on what it's instrumenting, but usually it can capture them. The second thing is now you have a transport, which means any Sentry data is allowed to exist. That means basically it will flush data when it can. So that means tracing can work, or if you're in like a web browser, it means you can do session replays or all these other things, right? So I have Sentry access now. Once I have Sentry, there's like a bunch of things I want to instrument. Those things are like, you know, uh, what are those calls that we're making? So the MCP tools, right? I want to know what's being called there. Fortunately, that's pretty easy to do. I forget if we have this manually instrumented. We do. Okay. So what I'm actually doing, because again, so there's a lot here. Apologies if you have no idea what I'm saying, but I'm just going to assume that you're well enough first. SSE, like WebSockets, like I mentioned, do not have full tracing support. What that means is when you connect to a server sent event server, so you subscribe to the stream of events that's coming, I could pass a trace ID into that through a web header, like a normal header. That's great. That trace ID is kind of disappearing somewhere. I think we'll fix this with our MCP wrapper, but for now, what I've done is instead of looking at one session and having to trace for that, I'm just saying every single tool call is a new trace. So I start a new trace. I start a span on that trace, which is this mcp.tool call with the tool name. And I believe this is a formal spec from OTel. I'm pretty sure I didn't make this up. So this is like per OTel semantics. So under the hood, Sentry tries to work with OTel. We're not technically like an OTel. We're not OTel. We're like a different thing, but we try to support it pretty well. The first off, I've created a span. And what this creates is a transaction. What we think of as a transaction, like a web request response, it's how you reason about performance most days. So I've got this transaction, mcp.tool tool name. So like list issues. In that, first off, I'm binding the user ID if it's present. It may not be present if you're using standard IO because this is present, generally speaking, when you're using Sentry's cloud authentication. I'm binding the client ID. This is super important because it's helped us like diagnose like, okay, is it a specific, like, is it Claude where all these errors are happening or is it Cursor or something like that? And then the rest is business as usual. Other than I'll note, I have this log and format error. So no matter what, it'll capture errors and it does two things here. One, it responds with the error upstream. And this is to help the LLM figure out how it should address it. So for example, we return errors from the API that are like, oh, you don't have access to that feature, or you need to pass a project identifier and you didn't. So little things like that that actually influence what the LLM does. And then second, if it's unhandled, we capture it. This log error abstraction actually goes to Sentry. And then we return the event ID to the user. This pattern, people do not do this enough. This is Sentry's event ID that we create. You can plug this into Sentry and our MCP now, look up the exact error that was caused. So if a customer ever reports this error to you, it's easy to find. It's like, again, I don't know why people don't do these things. Maybe just people don't know about them. But like this pattern is so unbelievably useful. So logs it, whatever. Mostly straightforward. That's core Sentry. You can see it here. This is an overly complicated abstraction that I've like copy pasted my own code bases. It's mostly because in some cases I want to attach files for other context, which is just like arbitrary attributes. Instruments I've used in agents to say attach the input. So I would be like, here's how you might use this, like log error, some OpenAI error that happened. And then I would like, maybe I don't need context. And I'm like, okay, I need an attachment. And it's like input.json. And then, it's like JSON stringify the input or something like this. And so you can actually view these in Sentry. Like they're an attachment where you actually have to like click to expand the file kind of thing, but it's super useful for like debugging random things. And so I do this in one of my other projects where whenever there is an error from the prompt, and it's usually like the JSON schema is mismatched because they're not perfect at this, I'll just upload the input and the output so I can understand what the match problems are. Anyways, so just an abstract. Otherwise, it's just like Sentry.capture, capture error or capture exception. Anyways, okay. Most important thing, we've got the trace context in here. I've done it for resources, prompts, and tools in our MCP server. Pretty straightforward though. But this context, super useful. Highly recommend. I've gone deeper than this a little bit. So if you go into the tools themselves, I showed you this earlier, I'm also setting the organization slug tag. And so again, this is useful. So if there is an error or a trace in Sentry, I can see which organization it's happening to in production, and then I can go debug that. Because sometimes like we have a lot of APIs, there's a lot of feature paradigms. In all honesty, our API is not, it's kind of a mess. And that means we have some wacky API responses sometimes because we fucked up, And so having this little bit of information actually super, super useful. But on top of that, in the API client, I'm also, where is it at? I'm logging every request. And so you might get this actually, I think you do get this out of the box with Sentry. You don't have to do this console log because it uses fetch and we instrument fetch. Um, but this was useful on like Cloudflare before I had Sentry on there. But what's really nice about this is I actually have like the right information generally to debug a problem and whatnot, and it ends up being like pretty good. And so it's just a few bits of information, and then you've got like functional production monitoring. I will say we're going to make this easier. There's too much boilerplate, frankly, in a lot of this. But the important things you need to understand are when you have a web service, when Sentry is wrapping something, sometimes it can create the trace itself. So in our case, on Cloudflare, it's wrapping the worker. It'll automatically flush the data to Sentry. But standard IO, maybe it won't. And so when we actually do this in standard IO, you also note down here that I'm calling flush. And I'm basically calling it if it errors or if we've just ended for some wacky reason. And this basically just tries to send the events to Sentry before it exits the process. Mostly straightforward. Okay. I would show you what this looks like in Sentry, but 100% I will leak some kind of customer data. Actually, let's risk it. I'll figure out how to scrub this. Um, high risk, high risk, high risk. Let's see where this is going to send me. Oh, thank God. Okay, we're on a safe page. We've not, we've not breached any compliance concerns right here. You'll find there's a bunch of cryptic errors in here. One day we will figure out how to make JavaScript good. Interesting, I'm not going to click these because I know there's PII in here because I fixed this bug earlier. I had an issue in the standard IO interface, and because I had Sentry in there, distributed on NPM, this is running on people's machines, I was actually able to find and fix this bug and release like 0.7.1 earlier to address this. But what's cool is I actually have all of this stuff, right? And let's see, where is the safe thing? I may have to figure out how to black out some stuff, but I think it's in Explore, and then I think we want, okay, this is safe. So far, so good. And so I'm not going to go into the by org thing because you'll see organization names, and I'm not going to show that. But as an example, I can actually see who's making the request. This is analytics. This is pure analytics, by the way, but this is tracing that's doing this. And what I could do is I could go in here. Actually, this one's me, so this one's safe. I can see requests that I myself have made, and this table is kind of brutal on this monitor. But here's all the tool calls my user ID has made. They don't really matter. This is performance data, right? Like unless these are erroring, I'm not going to take much action on it, but they are here. What's pretty cool because Sentry is Sentry, and we link to services. I actually have the downstream API calls. But this is just tracing, tracing 101. But we have the issue details call in here. It was made by me. There's not tons of information in here, but I could augment it if I needed to. Like you'll see I have the MCP server version. It was 0.6.0 when I made this. And you'll note if you remember, I'm binding that right here, right? So pretty useful. Again, I have no idea how anybody builds production software without Sentry these days. Like, sure, you could do something that's like a Sentry alternative. I don't know why you would. It's irrational. But not having even remotely anything that looks like Sentry, I just don't get it. Like even just the errors, but the traces are more powerful. So it's like spent a lot of time making this work. Oh, the one cool thing I wanted to show you all. Please no PII. Please don't make me learn how to scrub this. Yeah, we're good. Okay. I'm not going to scroll down because there's a little bit of a risk that an API endpoint will have a perimeter that's an org name. This is our new logging product. Ignore this filter thing. We'll improve our data scrubbing so maybe it doesn't filter the whole request, but you can expand these. They have trace IDs. I could link them back to the trace. I could link them to the errors. It's still new. Doesn't do a lot yet. I'm not going to dive into it because, again, I don't want to learn how to edit videos and I don't want to have to scrub data. But it's all wired up and it's actually pretty easy with just the things. And I think the beta is open, so you can try it out if you want. MCP usage by tool might have org names, so I'm not going to do that either. Anyways, Tracy, fucking cool. Gives you a lot of power, makes debugging way easier, is way complicated. And I will spend a bunch of time over the next week teaching you how to actually use it well. Frankly, because we've not done a good job yet at the company. We need to do better. But we're going to focus on the MCP thing, how to make it wired up there. We're going to have some cool stuff coming for agents around it too. That may just make it easier to work with LLMs. The last thing I wanted to talk about is evals. I'm a big, applied engineering. I just build software. I don't care about academics. Evals are tests. I wanted them to work like tests. And so, first off, if you don't know what an eval is, think of it this way. I've got a thing that I'm asking an LLM to do. How do I evaluate if it did it or not? I can't be like, assert 1 equals 2 because it's variable, right? It's non-deterministic. And so instead I say, hey, other LLM or same LLM, does this look like you did the thing I asked you to do? That's an example of one version of an eval, right? But it's just a test, but it's more of a fuzzy test, if you will. And so we're actually running these. Is it this one? No, it's this one. We're actually running these. Yeah, take a look at the GitHub workflows in this repo. Mostly just focus on test and eval. These two are like Sentry specific things. But we run these whenever certain things change. And all it's doing, it's using this package I built, uh, the way I blogged about it here, called the test evals, which is just a simple abstraction on top of a vitest, vitest, whatever, that looks like brain trust, looks like Evilite. That just makes it really easy to write these and treat them like normal tests. That's all it is. But same idea. It should be compatible with Brain Trust's auto evals package, which is where a lot of these scores come from. I'm not going to try to teach you to become an expert on that. You can look at this package. It's on my blog, Kramer, npm, whatever. Look at our repo. It's fine. This is running that on certain commits, but what's most important is what is the, oh, I guess they're all in these files. So you'll notice I'm using a .eval thing. All I'm doing is overriding the Vitesse config here. So it'll actually run those. I'm also using a specialized reporter that I built. But you'll see all this is doing is looking for the .eval files. Otherwise, this is literally just native Vitesse. Like you could write other tests in these same files. The reason we have them separate and not bundled with the other tests in this repository is because it costs money to run. They take a lot longer. They might fail. Sometimes they actually time out quite a lot. Even though the timeout's at 30 seconds, they'll just like straight up timeout. And so your semantics around like, do they need a pass? How often do they need a pass? All these other things might be a little bit different. So we treat them as a separate repository. Two things that happen in here. One, mock service workers to mock our API, but to not mock OpenAI's API, but it mocks Sentry in here. So that's all this is. Otherwise, we're just starting the standard IO server with the API mocked. That's all you got to know. So standard IO transport is running in the background. And this is actually why I first built the standard IO transport, because I needed it to more easily test things. And then we just go into one. And let me wrap this. And I've got a few of these evals defined, like I showed you earlier. And it's all it's doing is like, okay, if they're above 0.6, we're going to call this a pass. And the reason I do 0.6, by the way, is literally just because of this implementation. The submitted answer is a superset of the expert answers and is fully consistent with it. That's a 0.6. That's a passing grade to me, right? That means it's good enough of an answer. It's mostly correct. I don't care about the minor details of it. Sometimes this will still fail, but generally speaking, like a single model is reliable enough and the tests are pretty simple that it works. So these are evals. Maybe that's good. I think that's a lot. I don't think there's much else you kind of need to know to get up and running, let alone that like I have strong opinions on. I think the main things are just like, it's not that overwhelming. It's an API service. It's like RPC. You can consume an existing API, which is what we did. It's pretty easy to output, like to do that intermediary with Cloudflare, which has been phenomenal. It's still rough. It's broken all the time. Like literally, Cody, one of the guys at Sentry, has been working with this, and he has to wipe his authentication cache like so frequently because of random bugs. Which like MCP Remote has had some problems, and I think Glenn, who works on it, mentioned he thinks he has them fixed now, which is why if you're using MCP Remote, just use the newest one. There's issues with like say cursor disconnecting, like you can see kind of over here. Actually, I'll just show you. Like, do we still have it running? We have it running here, probably. I don't know what that error is. Oops. Let's do this just to make sure it's running. But just in case you haven't seen what it does, this should still be running. These are all the tools Sentry exposes. By the way, I have a blog post on you should check my blog. There's some limitations. Don't expose a lot of tools. I talked to you about the context limitation. There's some other problems that are still going on. They'll probably get better in the near term, but like, what are the most recent bugs impacting Sentry/remote MCP? Which org name, project name, in the descriptions. If you look at the repo, I've told it that this is how it should infer that information. This should query the tool that's provided via the local MCP server, which is again just connecting to our cloud service. And so it's calling list issues. It's called Sentry remote MCP. Exactly what we want to do. Last scene, we got some invalid URL strings. We got some other stuff. It's kind of what you want. Useless. It's a demo. But there's a bunch of cool shit. I have another video. It's somewhere here on the YouTube saying, talking about Sierra and AutoFix, which we're going to call issue fix. I think that's the final name, where we'll generate a root cause analysis, which is really, really sick if you haven't tried it. It is so unbelievably good for complex problems. We'll root cause analyze something, and then you can pull it into Cursor using the MCP and try to fix it there. And what that means is like it'll take all this context Sentry has built up, bring it into Cursor, and then Cursor can actually be responsible for like how would we actually make a fix for this based on everything we know now, which it's pretty good at code gen. So it's like kind of offsets like best of both worlds. So I guess with that said, I'm going to stop the video there. I'm going to record a bunch more stuff, I think, over the next week, write up some stuff, try to get more some consumable content, like meatier bits around some of these concepts and some of the challenges, frankly, of working through this. But, I don't know. Hopefully this is useful, entertaining. I don't know, whatever. But cool. Thanks for hanging out.